Hello and welcome to another episode of Extra Vibes. This time we're talking about the top 10 debut albums. Of course, I'm joined by Lee Graham once again.
How you doing, Ryan? Thanks for having us back, mate.
It's good, isn't it? It's interesting. We were just talking before we kind of went on here about, we were looking at this list, and from my perspective anyway, it was like, these, even if you disregarded the fact that we're debut albums, some of these albums could be considered, most of them could be considered as some of the greatest albums ever. Throw out the debut thing, like they're still incredibly top drawer. It's crazy.
It is crazy how much, some people would have said in other things, that, a band has a whole career to write their first album. Sometimes I think that's prevalent. Sometimes I don't think it is necessarily, but arguably there is a case for certain albums, certain debut albums being the more pinnacle moment of a band's career sometimes.
Yes, it's interesting. As you say there, I think for some bands in some cases it can be almost like a best of the last so many years that they've been, if they've been going 6 years prior, it's like, you got 6 years potentially worth of material. So yeah, that's interesting. Before we get into the top 10, do we have any honourable mentions? Because we usually do.
Yeah, there are a few from my point of view, to be fair. But there was quite a lot of only mentioned.
Yeah.
First one that came to mind was Black Crowes' "Shake Your Money Maker."
Oh yes, of course.
Make It. That was certainly an album that had an impact on me. They were supporting Aerosmith at the very first gig I ever went to, and that was the first time I'd seen a real shift in a band's performance in terms of everyone else was on before them, and then sort of went back and then listened to the album again and sort of made that more personal connection. I haven't seen them live, so yeah, "Shake Your Money Maker" was up there for me. The only reason they didn't go up in there was because I realised when I was thinking about it that it was more the memory it evoked in terms of an album reminding me of my first gig than it was the album itself, if that makes sense. Which is something I've tried to stick to it. It's not trying to about memories or gigs, this one. So it was more about trying to go about a physical offering of songs rather than the memories that they evoked, which is the only reason it didn't get thingied. Another one was Stone Temple Pilots' "Core." That one just missed out on my list. And I really struggled between not getting it in, but it was a case of there's albums on this list that I think as a debut albums are better, and with "Core," although hell, I think it had a great impact, I would arguably say that there are songs later in the band's career and albums later in Stone Temple Pilots' career that were equally as good. I've sort of tried to keep this as a list of debuts where I think they packed the biggest punch.
That's a fair shout. My honourable mentions: Pearl Jam, 10.
Cool.
It was different for a brief period. It was in the top 10, but then it dropped out because of a couple of others that I can't yet reveal. Yeah. But, so again, that's it. They kind of. It was interesting that album and that time that came in with this kind of wave of grunge bands, but they kind of walked this line where it's like grunge rock still.
Yeah.
And I think they hit a perfect balance because it was just perfect for that time.
Definitely.
And they were different. Like you saw, particularly when Nirvana were knocking about, you just had a load of bands that were kind of like Nirvana, whereas they were doing their own thing, and it was just it's even though that was their debut, it's kind of almost taken over the rest of their career. That's always the one that people think of when you think of Pearl Jam. So it's kind of dominated things for them. It'd be interesting to know whether people get sick of the debut who are in the band. Another one of my honorable mentions is Boston, the self-titled album. It gets in the honorable mentions. I've had a look at other lists, and I've seen it keeps popping up, and I've listened to the album again. The thing is, it's not my personal taste, but it's when you look back, it's full of cliches, but it's because that's where the cliches came from. You know, it's that kind of thing. So I think that it had to get a mention because of the impact that it's just had. So yeah, I'll throw that in. And my final two that I'm going to kind of bunch together is Wolfmother, the self-titled album.
Okay.
Because there was this kind of era, wasn't there, around where you had Wolfmother, Black Stone Cherry, The Answer. And the other one that is included in that is Black Stone Cherry as well, because there was this kind of resurgence around that time. Definitely. And Wolfmother were kind of at the top of that tree along with Blackstone. And it just kind of kicked off this kind of a almost like the first wave of the new wave of classic rock.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, that was interesting, particularly when I was a kid. Like they were the kind of the new bands that were my bands.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's the same with many others. But yes, we'll go straight into the number 10s. What is Lee's number 10?
Okay, so my number 10 actually sort of goes back to what you were saying about that first wave, the new wave of classic rock bands. And they're a band that never quite seemed to make it. But having, you know me, I'm an idiot, and I will put up, I'm listening to this on the way to work this morning on my Facebook. Yes. And when I've put this album up before, it seems to be a band and an album that's got quite a cult following. The band is Silvertide, and it's their Show and Tell album.
Oh, I forgot they existed.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people either didn't know or forgotten.
Yeah, completely forgot about them.
I saw them supporting Velvet Revolver on their Contraband tour. And, you know, went down there, and they absolutely hit me in the face. And I was like, I've got to have this album. And it's an album that I still listen to regularly. It's an album that when I heard it, you know, it's like a live setting of a support band. You don't really know the songs too well. And I knew I wanted to hear it. And so, you know, on the way I went back through via the merch thing and grabbed their album and their American Excess EP off the guys. And, you know, listened to it, soaked it up. And it was an album that I was utterly convinced that these are going to be the next big thing. Having seen how they do a show, and hearing this album, which was produced by Kevin Shirley, of course, who's done Iron Maiden and Aerosmith. Oh, sorry, it was mixed by Kevin Shirley, not produced, it was mixed by him. But, you know, having that involvement with someone like Kevin Shirley in the album, and the songs on it, like, you know, Blue Jeans and, you know, Coming Home and all sorts of stuff that's going on that record. In fact, I knew I was going to end up forgetting the song list.
Oh, I always forget song names. Here we go.
But you know, stuff like Ain't Coming Home and Devil's Daughter and So Fucking Crazy and You Want It All and Foxhole Jesus Christ. There's 11 tracks on this record, and there's not one that I ever skip, you know, and that came out 2005, 2006, and I was utterly convinced that this was an album that was going to set them above everyone else, and I don't know why it never did. They never released anything after that. I know they've done a couple of sporadic shows, but for whatever reason, it never came to any more fruition than that. But that's my
one and done.
Yeah,
it's an interesting one. My number 10 is we kind of briefly touched on them in the honourable mentions there. It's The Answer with Rise. For me, this was kind of in that era, same time as Silvertide there. This particular album it felt like a cut above everybody. Like they walked the line between this kind of real classic rock style, and it felt modernized, it felt new, it felt fresh. And it was like, I listened to it again recently for this, and I would say the opening 6 tracks are just all absolutely killer, one after another.
All the way through, like no questions asked. It's just,
yeah, it's like you can just keep going and going and going with it. And for me, this has always been, as you mentioned there, this has been an album that I will keep going back to because it's just cracking. And you know, I'm as a side note to that, I'm very excited to see what they're going to be doing next because they're obviously coming back.
Release new music very soon, so I'm very excited.
Exactly. And they're another band that I think that because they came in so strong and with such an awesome debut album, it's kind of it's set the bar so high that people were expecting maybe even higher than that.
Yeah.
And maybe they've found a bit of difficulty with trying to match that. But it'd be interesting to see where they go next. But for me, this one had to be in there, and it's one of the kind of newer ones in this list for me. So moving on, what is Lee's number 9?
So my number 9 is, I think we're both sort of starting with the newer side of things, to be honest, in that same thing, but it's what's had an impact. But my number 9 is Temperance Movement and Self-Titled, their self-titled debut. I remember this one coming out. I think, unlike Silver Tide, I think it did get the attention it deserved. I think there was a lot of making a massive impact on it. I mean, I remember buying the album and then realizing that I bought the album, and then I realized that 2 days after I bought the album, they were playing Norwich, which is only sort of up the road from me. No one knowing who they were. So, yeah, amazing. I was like, I need to go. So I called a mate of mine, and I was like, because I used to give him a lift to work. It's like, that album I had on the car yesterday? He's like, yeah. I'm like, they're playing Norwich tomorrow. You liked it, so you're coming. Like, I will buy you a ticket.
You're obligated.
You're obligated now. If you don't want to lift to work for the rest of the week, then that's fine. But that album just had such a big impact, and I thought all the way through from Ain't No Telling and Only Friend to Midnight Black, I thought the production on it was really good. I thought it captured their energy on the album. I think it delivered all the promise that those guys had. Sadly, Temperance Movement are no more, or at the moment. I'd love to think that they were coming back together. I think Phil's got one of the finest voices going. I think he's got a great rock voice. I think he's, as a front man, I know some people refer to him as a bit of a rock and roll Jamiroquai with his stage performances, but I absolutely love him. The thing is, I love Jamiroquai, right? So when someone put that in a review, I didn't take that as an insult. I thought, that's cool. And, I've seen them live. I think they're great. Yeah, and going through all the way through. And for me, people often talk about, the magic third album, that a band's got a couple of albums to find their feet, and then you get the magic thirds like, Bon Jovi, Slippery When Wet, or Aerosmith's Toys in the Attic, or wherever it might be. But for me, I think it had all the stature of that magic third record when they came in out the gate, so to speak. But yeah, that's my number 9.
Yes, the rock version of Jamiroquai.
You put it on posters.
I was going to say, people need to put that on posters, T-shirts, everywhere.
I'd take it.
Exactly. I'd buy it. My number 9. We're going heavily into the classics immediately. It's Led Zeppelin 1, the very first. For me, this is an example. I mean, everybody knows that I like my Led Zeppelin. This shows how strong the rest of the list is. The fact that this is number 9, very much like you said there, with bands usually they'll have the second album or the third album where it's like they really kind of nail who they are and that's iconic sound that they've got. With the first Led Zeppelin album, it's there's definitely that in there, but I think that everything else they did afterwards just kicks it up another gear. Like Led Zepp 2 is kind of where they really come into their own, I think. But that album, when it came out, it came out in, let me just have a look, 1968. And it kind of changed the game again. It's an album game changer, I think. When you hear that, and then you look at the through the history, and you see these other albums and other bands that came along after Led Zeppelin. There were some that are very similar, just a year or 2 years after. So for me, it's that impact. So it has to be in the top 10, I think. Ooh. Yes. Moving on, your number 8.
And my number 8, I would argue, not completely different to Zeppelin, but I would say another game changer in terms of music, and that is Rage Against the Machine, self-titled.
Oh, yeah.
I was fortunate enough, we spoke about, both our dads being into music and stuff before. And although my dad loved Aerosmith and Zeppelin and Sabbath and Priest, he also, when grunge was coming around, I was listening to it straight out the gate. As I was Rage Against the Machine when that came out, man, my dad was a big Rage Against the Machine fan, so I was fortunate enough to catch it very early on. And because I guess stylistically, I'd never heard anything like Rage. I was 7, 8 years old and I was listening to stuff didn't sound like guitar, bass and drums. This sounded otherworldly, And I think it's fair to say that they changed the musical landscape forever with this record. You've had bands since it. You obviously had the new metal genre that sort of came out, which arguably took massive influences from bands like Rage. But I don't think no one has ever played that style of music with the same panache and same attitude about it. Obviously, there's all the political side of Rage as well. The debut, I think I'm right in saying this, is 30 years old in November.
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. And, you've got all the songs that were on that first record, with like Bomb Track and Take the Power Back and Know Your Enemy, of course, Killing in the Name of, Bullet in the Head. And all those songs, when you listen back to the album, I listened to it again recently while I was going through debut albums, and it still hits you with that same ferocity, that same fear, that same passion, that same aggression. And because of everything that was going on in the world then, 30 years ago, and everything that's going on in the world now, it still sounds really current. It still sounds, sadly, like no progress has been made in the last 30 years.
Yes.
Which you like to think, you think now listening back to 30 years ago to Rage was like when we were kids listening to Motley Crue and how much the world had changed in that. And you wouldn't put on, Theatre of Pain or something and think, oh, well, this sounds like it could have been made today.
It's could have been done yesterday.
but with Rage, I get that, you get that feeling that it does. And so for those reasons, it's my number 8.
That's a strong choice. It's very much, as I was saying there with Led Zeppelin, is, when you bring out an album and then a year, 2 years later, you're seeing a lot of other bands that are having a similar style, that, it's made a real kind of wave in the music industry, and not just in your little bubble at that point. It's
exactly.
I think the ultimate compliment is when other musicians clearly recognize that there's something to it.
I did do a really cool interview once with Tim Comfort, the bass player from Rage. And he was the guy was trying to say the influence that Rage had, and he said, what do you say about having all the influences on bands like Korn and Limp Bizkit? And Tim Comfort turned around and said, if we are in any way responsible for Limp Bizkit, then I wholly apologize.
Oh dear. Well, I don't accept your apology. Moving on to my number 8. We're going to go for another classic. It's The Doors, self-titled. This came out in very early 1967. And yeah, exactly. And if you look at that kind of era and the music that was coming around in that kind of time, this sounds completely different. It's lyrically, it's just out there, isn't it? Like if you hear stuff from that era, it's just so bizarre compared to everything else that's going on at that time. I think it's a brave album to release at that period. And again, it's another one where afterwards you're seeing a lot of similar kind of things, and people are starting to think more outside of the box. So they're kind of, it wouldn't surprise me at all that, they're responsible for a lot of stuff, particularly Jim Morrison. How many times have you heard singers say Jim Morrison inspires me? Numerous times. Lots of iconic tracks now that are just to some younger people, maybe they haven't even heard the full album, they'd still know songs off it.
Anyone would know, Break On Through to the Other Side, or
exactly. Like This Is the End. It's,
Yeah.
It's integrated into pop culture at this point. It's everywhere. Like, I vaguely remember hearing the end in a Simpsons episode.
Yeah.
It's like when it's bleeding through into that. I mean, that was released in the 90s, so that was years after that came out, and it's still
White World and everything.
Yeah, there's just so much in there, and even if you look at them as a band, the way that Jim Morrison was performing, and what he was doing, it was so different to everything else that came before. So for that reason, it has to be in there. So that's my number 8.
That's a good choice, man. Like, it's an album that passed me by until relatively later on. And, you think all the albums that are going to have an impact on you are the ones you listen to your teenage years, and a lot of mine are. But yeah, it's a great record, the Doors album. I mean, I didn't start listening to the Doors till I was like in my 20s. They were a band that would float around. My dad liked them and stuff, but they were never a band that really grabbed me. And then, I think that what's happening now is because it was just done in such a different era.
When I was a teenager, I didn't really understand it. I thought, this is a bit odd. It's a bit weird, because you're that kind of disconnected from it. You're in a completely different era. When you've got, very contemporary music, this kind of seems a bit, I don't know, maybe you could use the word dated to a degree. But I've seen it a lot with a lot of artists and other people that I know. When you go into your 20s, now that seems to be the kind of era now where people start to like the Doors and start to kind of understand it a bit more, perhaps.
I think so.
Yes. So moving on to number 7.
My number 7. Again, I think we're going back and forth with doing something completely different from one each other, which is what this is all about, mate.
Exactly.
But my number 7, again, is similar themes, though. I would argue is a band that, again, changed music. And I would argue that, bands thereafter them definitely changed their sound or adopted sounds. You had bands like Cure and Gary Newman, Depeche Mode doing it previously. But my album of choice is 9 Inch Nails or Pre-Hate Machine. I think when they came out, that was tracks like Head Like a Hole and Sin. Their use of not only of the way they were writing songs, but their use of synthesizers, the way I know they were used previously, you can take that all the way back to, bands like Kraftwerk and stuff like that. But the way in which Trent used them in 9 Inch Nails, and trip hop loops and drum machines and bringing it all in just showed, it seemed to expand everyone's mind into the possibilities of these various areas. And arguably, their set to this day still draws on heavily from that early period of 9 Inch Nails. And I feel that Pre-Hate Machine had a real big impact. It wasn't necessarily their favourite album of theirs for me, but I feel that as a debut, it showed all the promise that they led to go on for the rest of their career. A bit like you were saying there, of course, with like Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
Album 1, and then also all the way through, where they found themselves, I think, on like Down the Spiral, they really found themselves. But yeah, that's my number 7 for 9 Inch Nails.
Solid choice. My number 7, another one that I would consider an absolute classic. It's Jeff Buckley with Grace.
Oh, nice.
This came out in 1994. I was 1, but if you listen to the music around that time, Jeff Buckley was something completely different.
Yeah, he was.
And he interestingly walked this line. I recently watched when he went on, it was like BBC, it was like Late Night or something with somebody. And the presenter before that was saying that he's managed to capture both that young and old audience. Like, you had kids that were like loving him, and you had people that, before that would listening to like Led Zeppelin and stuff, and for me, that vocal ability, particularly on Grace, is second to none. I mean, I would I would put him up there with like some of the best vocalists I've ever heard. You know,
his vocal range was insane.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And like there was a Lilac Wine, that cover he did. It's ridiculous. You know, Hallelujah. Again, it's another cover, but it's like he does it in such a way that he's made it his own.
Even Leonard Cohen said that was like the best version of Hallelujah.
I was gonna say there, it's like he's kind of overshadowed the original, and you know, stuff like Grace and Last Goodbye. It's like, you know, you can keep going. So Real, which is kind of a bit of an odder song, you know, it's a bit more out there, but there's just so much, you know, his guitar ability as well, you know, is second to none. But yes, he's an artist that's, you know, he's a one and done. Of course. Yeah. Obviously things were curtailed after that. So it's interesting though with Jeff, because that album has just stuck. Like,
completely. The massive impact that's had, like you say, from '94, so you're talking 28 years ago now.
Yeah,
all the way through. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, this is it. You know, I mean, I saw about a month ago, I was in a vinyl shop and I saw a kid that was about 18 years old who was seemingly excited to see that Jeff Buckley was in. You know, and that's how many years ago, you know what I mean? Like, there is still this kind of, well, I have to buy this record.
No.
You know, I think he was just starting his vinyl collection and it's like, that was one of his go-tos.
I think it's that go-to for a lot of people. When lockdown kicked in and I got my vinyl player, it was one of the first ones I had to get was Grace.
Yeah.
It's just such an impact of an album.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, that's kind of one of the ones that really stick. Moving on. What's your next choice?
So my number 6 is one that you mentioned in your honourable mentions, and that is Wolfmother's Self-Titled.
Oh, that's quite high up. I'm surprised.
Yeah. It was an album that, like you say, it came around along that era where The Answer and Black Stone Cherry. And whereas The Answer and Black Stone Cherry continued their career, I know Wolfmother have gone off and on, and Andrew Stockdale's gone and done solo albums. For me personally, and I can only speak for myself, I don't think they ever reached the height of their debut again. And I can only talk for myself. There's other people who love the latter day, the sort of second, third, and so forth. Albums they've done, and I've had people saying to me that, you know, certain albums they prefer, and it's just all opinion. But for me, they never got as far as the debut album. When, you know, the first time I heard Joker and Thief, I think was the first track I heard off of it. And, you know, like you say, it's in that period where all these sort of first of new wave of classic rock bands are coming through. And I was like, this is a band for me, this, and liking this. And then I went and bought the album. I absolutely fell in love with it. And then after, you know, probably like 6-7 months after I got the album, they played Download Festival on the Friday, and seeing the reaction they got live to those songs as well, it was like seeing that and going, wow, okay, well, this album has just not impacted me. This has impacted, you know, a good few thousand people here who've turned up to watch their set at sort of, you know, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon or whenever they were on. And I just thought that album showed so much premise that I don't feel was followed up on, but it doesn't take away from the impact that the album itself had. You know, when you you've got tracks like Joker and the Thief, Woman, Where Eagles Have Been. It's just wall-to-wall bangers, mate. I just feel like it's one of the most solid debuts of the last.
No, I have to agree. The first one I heard, I think, was Dimension.
Okay.
And it's just, it walks that line because it's retro-y, but it feels modern at that time. And it's interesting because it was, I think, I remember seeing an article. It was in Classic Rock when it had just come out. They were saying it was like, you know, if Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin had a child,
I remember
like that was kind of like the outcome. and it does feel kind of like that, but there's some other stuff in there as well, and it's it's I would say of these kind of modern ones, there's them and The Answer, as I mentioned there. I think those two albums in particular were a cut above. I do remember Wolfmother were everywhere when this album
really were everywhere at one point.
Yeah, like they look like the band that would be
the ones to sort of take it over to the sort of mainstream almost.
Yeah, they look like they were bleeding over, because I remember they were in like Guitar Hero. And obviously that was a game for the younger people that was very big at the time. But it was kind of bleeding in, and you were seeing them kind of more and more in mainstream things.
Yeah.
Which I think, for that to carry over, like they were the only one really that kind of carried over, I think.
Yeah, I think they did. I mean, even on like small level, at the time that album came out, I was in my first year at uni. And I used to DJ a lot of the rock clubs and stuff. And some of the nights I used to do was more general rock nights. And then I used to do, there was a night that was called Raucous, which tended to be like the indie side of things, but not necessarily my cup of tea, but it was 50 quid in my back pocket while I was at uni. But it tended to be, that wave of things like the Kooks and Franz Ferdinand and Killers and all that side of things. And I was DJing there one night, and I had a guy come up to me and say, "Can you play Woman?"
Interesting.
And I was like, okay, so it's sort of filtering across to this side of things. It was one of the few tracks I could play it in Raucous, which is this indie sort of night, and then I could go upstairs where the sort of smaller room was, and we used to have our rock night and then play it in there. It was crazy. There wasn't many tracks you could cross over on that, but that was one I remember used to get requests for a lot on it.
Yes, I think the one that you can say would be a clear crossover is Apple Tree.
Yeah,
I felt like that was kind of maybe their bridge. Like they were thinking, maybe try and go down that for one track anyway. But yeah, it's a very solid choice. My number 6 is one that I've always heard of him, but I never really dived into him until a few months back. It was during a conversation with TJ from the Georgia Thunderbolts.
Oh yeah.
Right. Well, he was absolutely banging the gong for Bob Seger.
Yeah.
Absolutely banging it, and he was like, his early work is like top drawer. For me initially, I always thought, Bob Seger. I was thinking, this is the guy, towards the latter end of the 80s, who was wearing like bizarre classic 80s stuff, and it sounded a bit more commercial.
Yeah.
But I went and heard Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, and I was like, this is ridiculously cool. And nobody talks about it. Like, nobody says anything.
I've delved into too much. I think I'm going to have to do that.
Honestly, it's like nobody talks about this album anymore. And it's so cool. It's a joke. It's like it's heavy for that era. This came out in 1969, and it is. There's so much, like there's raw vocal ability. It's very raw. It's very heavy for that time. It's, there are certain songs where it verges on early kind of hard rock at the time. It's like, and this is Bob Seger. It's like, it's like there was a clear transition at some point from this kind of real like rocky material to a more commercialized avenue in the latter half of the 80s. But his early work, I mean, I have to agree with TJ, his early work is outstanding. And I listened to this, and there's a couple of tracks where it's like it's a bit out there for that time. Like there's stuff like White Wall and Black Eyed Girl, which is, I mean, the bass on that, I mean, you're a bass guy, the bass on that song is ridiculous. Whoever played that, I can't remember his name, but honestly, it's an album that for people that go, Bob Seger, he's a bit he's kind of that guy.
Yeah.
I retain that it's the best thing he ever did. I think it's better than Night Moves. I think it's better than all of the rest of the stuff he did. But nobody always mentions it. Like, everybody forgets.
Yeah. I'm going to have to take that out or give that a proper spin, mate, because I'll be honest.
Honestly, yeah.
TJ was mentioned Bob Seger to me when I interviewed TJ.
Yes.
I think he's on a mission.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, it was that thing where it's like, I've just come to the opinion that Bob Seger isn't for me.
Yeah.
Which is, you're going to have artists like that.
No, it's exactly what I thought. I thought, he's not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
And honestly, if you hear that original album, it will change your opinion. There's a different style, definitely.
Yeah.
And it's certainly more towards this kind of classic rock, hard rock kind of avenue, which caught me by surprise. And I think it's a shame that you don't hear people talk about this album in particular, because for me, it's his best work.
Yeah. You feel it's almost got
a mile.
You feel like it's almost got lost from
it's kind of got buried in time. Nobody. I haven't heard anybody talk about it apart from TJ. Maybe that's why he's banging this gong for it, because it seems to have been forgotten, and that's why over this last half a year it's become one of my go-to albums that I'll listen to.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, it's right up there. So it's like it has to be in this top 10. When it's a debut. I mean, for me, this is ridiculous. It's a debut album. It's that level. Yeah. It feels like. I mean, I imagine that he'd been knocking about for a few years at this point. Like, it feels like almost like a best of, as we spoke about there, where it's like each track has just got so much to it every time. It's like banger after banger. And the title track there, Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, did briefly bleed back into popular culture again, because Quentin Tarantino used it in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Oh, right, okay.
So it's slightly crept back into existence again. But yes, for anybody that's like, I don't know about Bob Seger, go and check that album out, because it'll probably change your opinion.
I think I'm going to have to do that myself, mate, to be honest, because he's someone I assumed that just wasn't for me. But
yeah, I was the same opinion completely, honestly.
I was over.
It's a joke. What's moving into our top 5 now? Starting to get quite serious. What is your number 5?
Yeah, so I say top 5 now, mate, and a bit like when we did our albums of 2021 before. There's very minimal margin between this and the top one. But I will say this is the top one's the only one that's never changed. I was saying to you off there's others when I was writing notes and re-listening to stuff, I was like, oh, okay. Maybe I prefer this album over that, which I didn't realize I did until I started being a bit more thinking about it. But this album is not only one of my favorite debuts, it's one of my favorite albums of all time. And there was no way that this wasn't going to make my list. And it's the Wild Hearts with Earth versus the Wild Hearts. For me, the ferocity of this album, the songwriting is insane. The production is really great. I think the guys produced it themselves, so it's still got that raw quality, but with the side of things that the Wild Hearts do, that's all raw punk and roll that they do. It captures their energy live. Some would argue it's best album. For me, it's definitely up there. I think when they came back, Renaissance Men and 21st Century Love Songs, I think those two albums stand up against it. But you can't argue with the songwriting on it. I mean, I've always said I think Ginger's one of the finest songwriters going ever. He doesn't seem to be able to write a bad song. And like he does, what I love about Ginger is he'll go and do, right, I'm going to go do a pop record, and he forms Hey Hello and does one of the best pop albums I've ever heard in ages, and then he'll go and do whatever he wants to do. Sadly, Wild Hearts have gone on hiatus for a little bit by the looks of things. But Earth versus is just insane. You got tracks on it like, Caffeine Bomb, TV Tan, Baby's a Head Fuck, News of the World. It's certainly almost like you were saying there about, it's certainly acting like a greatest hits. Yeah. And I think arguably a lot of those songs that were just mentioned were still staples and still be those sort of highlights when you go see them live. There's still the songs, people want to hear Caffeine Bomb and TV Tan and Baby's Head Fuck and stuff. But for me, I think it gets overlooked quite a lot. of just how much of an impact it had. I mean, the album came out in 92, 93. And then, you know, you had bands like Three Colours Red and everything that came after with that sort of Brit rap therapy, I would argue, was influenced by it on their sort of mad stuff. You know, that kind of Brit rock, kind of dark, grungy punk that came alongside the sort of American grunge scene. You had sort of Brit rock of that era. And I would argue that a lot of those bands were heavily influenced by this record, sort of consciously or subconsciously. And yeah, for me, it's one of the best albums going. So it had to be in there.
No, it's a good shout. I like the difference that we have in these styles. I think between us, we have a hell of a list. You know, my number 5. This is an album that I remember as even a tiny kid. My dad used to just love, and he'd play. And I looked at this particular guitarist and I thought, how on earth could I ever get to this standard? Like, it was a joke. Right? So it's Van Halen, the self-titled album. You know, you hear Eruption and you think, well, this has just changed the face of music. You know, nothing's going to be the same now. And I mean, this came out in 1978.
78. Okay.
Yeah, 78. I mean, you weren't far off there. And you can tell that after that, it pretty much influenced most of the 80s. But, you know, particularly with guitarists. It's just classics, isn't it? You know, even the covers they do, you know, like You Really Got Me.
That's true.
You know, the way in which they do things, it was very different to what had come previously. And I think Eddie Van Halen in particular is possibly one of the greatest. I mean, some would argue the greatest guitarist of all time. But that style on that album, it just changed everything. And yeah, that's an album I always look at as kind of a benchmark. It's a hell of a benchmark.
It is.
You know what I mean? To think that that's their debut release.
Crazy, wasn't it? When they came out of the gate like they did, and you were saying there about Eruption. And I remember when I was in middle school, so I was like 11 or 12, I was kind of the only kid in the school who liked rock music. Everyone else was listening to Backstreet Boys or whatever, NSYNC or whatever they were listening to. And I wasn't sort of aware I was listening to anything different until I went to see Aerosmith at the age of 11, and everyone in the school went, "Who?" And I'm like, but in year 7, a mate of mine who's still one of my best mates to this day, Max, joined the school, and he was the other geeky, weird kid who liked rock music. And he also was the first person I knew who played guitar properly, not just like strumming it in school assembly. This guy had been playing for some time. And I remember going around his house, and we were like, you know, just starting to hang out and stuff, about 12 years old. And he picked up, and he's still an insanely good guitarist, but he played Eruption with the double tap. And it was the first person I ever saw do that. And I remember just watching, and that was probably, you know, 1978. So we're talking 20 odd years after the event, so to speak.
Exactly.
And you got, you know, him going, "Oh, I'm going to show off in front of my new friend because I can do this." And how many millions of kids have probably gone and done that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you've got people like, you know, Dimebag, obviously Pantera was a massive, you've only got to look at all the people that came out of the woodwork when, you know, Eddie Van Halen sadly passed away, and on all the influence that on people over the years. I mean, for me and my mates were talking about this round about the time that he passed away, of like influential guitarists. And we were saying it would be like Hendrix. You had Hendrix, then you had Eddie Van Halen, and then you had like Dimebag. And we can't think of anyone after Dimebag yet that's had that sort of cultural impact on, you know, how everyone wants to play guitar. You know, start off with, you know, Hendrix. Everyone wanted to play behind the head and play a Fender. Then you had Eddie come out of the back, and suddenly, like you say, everyone of the 80s was doing double taps and shredding. And then he went, "Oh, I'm going to go play synth now, and I'm not bothered by my guitar."
Yes, there is a video somewhere on VHS buried away somewhere of me as a baby dancing around to Jump. So it is ingrained in my
DNA, mate.
kind of psyche at this point. it's just always been there. It's an album that has just been constantly there, and for good reason, I would say. It's an iconic album, I think. Even just looking at the cover, it's just there, isn't it? Yeah. You know. So yes, that's my number 5. Moving into the top 4.
Cool. So my top 4 is an album I feel a lot of people will be on this, especially of my era, because it's certainly made a huge impact. And it's The Darkness with Permission to Land.
Wow. I was wondering whether this would bleed into your list.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that when it came out, I mean, I first heard, I actually first saw The Darkness supporting my dad's friend's band in a pub. It was really,
wow, that's really early then.
Yeah, because obviously they're from around this way. My dad's friend's band was playing a pub somewhere, and I went along with my dad. I was probably sort of 13 or whatever. And there was the landlady's nephew's band supporting them. It turned out that was The Darkness. So they came on, and obviously it was a lot rawer and everything, and they were quite early on in their career. But I remember like really enjoying them. Like, these guys, you know, are great. And then about 18 months, 2 years later, something like that, the video for Growing on Me was on like Kerrang TV, basically. And I was sort of watching Kerrang TV, and I'm like, Dad,
I recognise this lot. Yeah.
Hello with my dad into the living room, you know. And he's like, what? And I'm like, aren't they the band that were supporting Leroy's band? And he went, yeah. You know, and then it was sort of like, right, okay. And I went and bought Permission to Land when that came out, and saw the album ultimately explode. I mean, they headlined Reading Festival just on the back of that one on the back of Permission to
Land. Album. Yeah.
One album. You know, they went from. I mean, it's undoubtedly. I mean, I've particularly since they've got Rufus Taylor on drums. I think that the last few albums they've done have been absolutely brilliant. I really do. You know, there was a period where it went a bit not quite up to what I would expect from The Darkness, but they had, you know, Hotcakes they came back with, and it was a solid album, but I don't think it was them at their peak. But then again, they had, you know, upsetting the band with Ed Graham leaving and them still not really having a secure drummer and stuff. But without doubt, Permission to Land, you've got to give it to it. It is probably their most popular release, without doubt.
Yeah, I mean, this is the one that they were an interesting band at this time. Is to a further extent than what we were talking about with Wolfmother. They were firmly ingrained in mainstream culture.
Oh god, yeah.
I remember seeing them come on like Jonathan Ross. You know, that's a UK show for those that are abroad. And you know, like particularly in that time, what rock band do you see go on Jonathan Ross? You know, it's like, this is a mainstream Saturday night TV show.
I mean,
you know,
the point where like they started off like, you know, they came, and when the Permission came out, 2003, 2004?
Yeah, 2 or 3, I think.
Yeah, so they came out in the sea of the new metal era. There you have bands like Korn and Papa Roach and Linkin Park and Limp Bizkit, and all of which I loved at that time. But The Darkness, and I've always maintained this, that album was like my gateway back to what I truly loved, you know, and what I truly loved was blues, hard rock. You know, they, you know, like a lot of teenagers do, you go off and try and find your own thing. And, you know, the new metal thing came along, and I loved a lot of it, and I still do. But when The Darkness came back, it was like, okay, so what I really want is what I've always really wanted. I want loud drums. I want massive sing-along choruses. I want big guitar riffs. And, you know, The Answer confirmed that when they came along with Rise. Rise is a fantastic record, and that cemented it. But The Darkness was definitely my gateway back to that. Permission to Land, definitely. Now, people always go on about, you know, I believe in a thing called love and stuff like that. But you listened a little deeper on that album. You got like Get Your Hands Off My Woman. You got Black Shark. You got Love on the Rocks with No Ice. And Night in the Ruts. It's just a fantastic record. And I would still argue, I mean, the last time I saw Darkness was when they headlined Ramblin' Man Fest on the Friday. So that would have been 2019, that would have been, because it was when thinking, and you know, Justin Hawkins joked, he said, you know, this one's off our first album, we've done others since, but none of you wankers have bought any of those, you know.
I think they know it's most of that album is it's got songs that they're the ones that people want to hear, aren't they? The opening 6 tracks, I would say, are all hits.
Yeah, and I'd argue that no band has seen that kind of explosion since then. Not to that level.
Yeah,
I don't think. I mean, and the music chain, the industry is shifting.
In the space of 18 months to go from supporting your dad's friend's band to
headlining
Reading. I mean, that is a hell of an ascension. I mean, yeah, it shows that. I felt like they were a band that came along at the right time.
I think so.
There was something somewhere. Somebody must have spotted them and thought, this is the thing that we want now.
To shape everything that's going to come along to change the scene or change a pattern has got to be, the opposite of what's just happened. You had 80s with all the glam rock and the big pomp and all the sort of makeup and the image that came along with it. What comes along next after it? Grunge. They're out completely. And so equally, I think when you had, new metal and seen heavily at the time, where the market is saturated with bands who are just wearing jeans and t-shirts and hoodies. You've got turntablists, you've got people rapping, you've got no one singing, and there's no guitar solos. And then you get, I'm not slagging off any band of that era. It was a massive part of my teenage years, and I loved it. But then you got the darkness that come along in the midst of that. You've got Justin Hawkins wearing a sparkly catsuit.
It's a ballsy move, particularly in that time.
Yeah. Guitar solos. He came on to stage at Reading or one show I've seen, I can't remember if it was Reading or elsewhere, riding a glittery tiger from the back of the
There's an amazing story. It reminded me of I think Justin was talking about when they were doing the stadium tours. At some point he'd got a thing where he was riding a massive pair of breasts that were over the stadium, and it's like in that era where people were just having jeans and a t-shirt and not playing solos. It's maybe that's what it needed.
Maybe. I think it's what it did, because it definitely shakes it up. And then it, like I say, it busted that door open for bands who were doing that blues rock side things. And then, a couple of years later, you're getting bands like The Answer and Blackstone Cherry and Airborne and Wolfmother and bands like that coming through the ranks and playing more straight up rock again, where they weren't before. It's the classic thing on Metallica's some kind of monster documentary where Kirk's like, they're arguing, we can't do a guitar solo now because that's not what's going on. I mean, arguably, I think if you don't do a guitar solo, and it's sort of like, I'm with Kirk on that one, I think it cemented it to that period rather than freeing it from it. But that's another time for another beer sort of thing. But, you have bands even of Metallica's level who were like, we can't do a guitar solo because this is what's happening now.
Yeah,
for a band to come out of the ranks, unknown at the time, just going, we're going to have guitar solos on every song on the album. We're all going to be, 70s pomp and have some fun with it and bring fun and back to it and not be so serious and just have a good time. I think it was what was needed in the rock industry at that time.
No, I agree. My number 4, kind of a similar thing in terms of the game changer. It's Guns N' Roses with Appetite for Destruction. Cool. They came along they released this in 1987. So this was at a time where, you were getting bands like Poison and, Motley Crue and all of these kind of hair metal type bands. And Guns N' Roses, they just bring it back to that kind of classic rock at its finest. And this is widely considered one of the best debut albums ever by a lot of people. It's again, it's the mainstream thing now, isn't it? It's ingrained in culture. Welcome to the Jungle. I mean, that's your opening track on a debut album. It's an absolute joke. You've got like Paradise City, obviously, and like you're seeing now, there are pub bands that are playing these songs. That trickle down.
Yeah,
everybody wants to play these songs. Everybody wants to hear these songs still today. And obviously, you've got Slash there that's now become, he instantly became this guitar hero. And I think that they turned up at a time when it was really needed. You know, when rock was almost this kind of glam rock, it was almost bleeding towards pop. Like you had Poison with like very kind of, if you look at the structure of their songs, like Talk Dirty to Me and stuff like that, it had similar kind of rhythms to what pop music would be. It had the big choruses and things like that. And I think that Guns N' Roses, they just brought it back to where I think rock should be, but modernized it for that period of time. And I think they made things cool again.
They brought it back to that guttural kind of street level, didn't they? Like you say,
Yeah.
80s, what we were talking about there with the grunge thing, before grunge came back. Where it was, you know, it was all about your image, and it was, you know, big costume, big, you know, big hair, big makeup, big everything. And then you had, you know, Guns N' Roses who were walking around with like, you know, Slash with no shirt on and a pair of like trousers and a hat, and you know, Axl Rose running around in a pair of cycling shorts. And you know, I remember I've read, I don't know if you've read it, but it's a great read if you haven't. That's Steven Adler's autobiography. My Appetite for Destruction. And he's saying on one of the shows when they were still doing, when Guns N' Roses were still doing the makeup and everything, and Poison went on first, and they came on with all their glam era and all makeup and all that. And Steven Adler said he went and looked at them and went, "We're nothing like them. Why are we dressed like them?" And they literally said he literally just got like a towel in the sort of dressing room at backstage and just rubbed his fucking makeup off his face. And the rest of the guys did the same. We're like, well, we're just going to go be us because we're nothing like that. And you know, arguably, I would say it was indisputable that they became the bigger band. You know, you know, the irony being that Slash went and tried out for Poison.
That is weird.
Yeah, I was reading that Slash's biography, and he said he walked out, and you know, they were like saying, "So, you know, what are you going to wear on stage?" Because Slash, but he turns up on like jeans and Converse and a t-shirt, and he's like, "This."
Yeah.
And they're like, "Oh no, we need this, and we know, we can do this. We can put makeup on you." And Slash said, he walked out, and as he walked out, CeCe was walking in for his audition. He said as soon as he looked at CeCe, he was like, "I'm not getting this job."
Yeah.
You know, but you can't argue with Appetite, man. I mean, I know it's like you say, it's a one for a lot of people where it is their best, you know, probably the best received debut. Sweet Child of Mine gets played everywhere, and some people would argue that we've all heard far too many bad versions of it coming out of a pub somewhere on a Saturday night.
Exactly.
Equally, that does show the impact it's had. But if you even dig into like a little deeper on that album with tracks like My Michelle and Rocket Queen and Anything Goes, Mr. Brownstone, stuff like that. You just can't. There's not a track. It's not an album I listen to too often too. Because it's one of those albums, like you say, it's almost engraved into your social conscious with everything that's around you. Yeah. And so it's not one but then when I do put it on, there's always the songs that I forget about, like You're Crazy and stuff like that. And it's you know, it's just a really good choice, man. Really.
It's for me, it's a record that it's just classics. Just, you know, you just go down that track list, it's just classics. And as you say, that it's so much so that some of them are a bit like you're kind of sick of it because you hear all these other bands covering them. And I think if you try and throw that to one side and just look at the quality of the album, it's an outrageous album that came along at the perfect time. I mean, I felt if they were a few years earlier, it would have perhaps been a bit more difficult for them to break out. But if they were a few years later, it would have probably been a bit difficult. Yeah. It's just perfect. And yeah, that album for me, it's the one obviously that they've never surpassed, and it'll probably follow them.
You look at their set now, since they've reformed with Slash and Duff, you can argue that 90% of their set is still Appetite.
Exactly. It's the ones that people want to hear.
Exactly.
You know. Top three. We're getting very serious.
Very serious now, mate. Again, an album that's came around this similar period of my life to The Darkness, and one that hugely had a real big impact on me. And it's Audioslave's debut album. Produced, of course, by Rick Rubin. Rick Rubin was, I wouldn't say he put them together, but he certainly put them in contact, because obviously Audioslave, forming from when Zach De La Rocha left Rage Against the Machine. And initially they were looking for a new singer. They then decided, Brad and Tim and Tom decided they were going to just go for a new project. They'd been in the rehearsal rooms recording stuff with Rick, and him knowing that obviously Chris Cornell was just doing solo stuff at the time and wanting to be in a band, said, get together. And like I mentioned earlier, my dad was a big fan of Rage Against the Machine. He was a big fan of the grunge thing as well, so I was a massive fan of Soundgarden. And I remember both of us being like ridiculously excited that these sort of two worlds were going to collide. And I remember Kerrang making a big thing about the fact that they had the debut for the video for Cochise coming on. They was like, obviously this is before, social media and YouTube and everything else kicking things off. So Kerrang had the big sort of showcase, if you like, of video for Cochise. And it was something ridiculous. Like it was on at like 11 o'clock at night on a Wednesday or something ridiculous. It was like a midweek thing. And I've got school the next day and my dad's got work, and both of us are like, can you just play this video, please? And it came on. It just had such a big impact on me. And like we said about Cochise being on there as well. But, you got stuff like Show Me How to Live, Like a Stone, Gasoline, Exploder. It's just an absolute banger of an album. And for me, at the time it came out for me personally, I was just starting to play bass. I just started picking up bass. And for the bass lines on that from Tim Comerford, I was massively influenced by him, and would sit there with obviously Rage Against the Machine records and stuff, and then to have the same guy airing just as killer bass lines as far as I'm concerned, and new stuff. And it was that thing where, like, when they were advertising it, it was that thing of, it's, Rage Against the Machine and it's Soundgarden together. But Audio Slave were bigger than the sum of their parts, I think. I know they were bigger than just two bands colliding. And I think that they could have been bigger than either band had they continued. I've always argued the case that when we spoke about them with friends and stuff, that their last album that released, Revelations, is their best album, I think. But unfortunately, they released it, and then 6 weeks later, Chris Cornell decided he didn't want to be an Audio Slave anymore, and went off and did a solo thing for a little bit before forming Soundgarden, and then obviously Rage Against the Machine reformed. They did do a couple of live shows over in the States, and then obviously sadly Chris Cornell passed away. But I did see in interviews beforehand that they were planning to do more shows, and I was hoping for that to come to the UK, because I sadly never got to see Audio Slave live. But the impact on this album for everyone, it was something that was different. The lot of the stuff that I was listening to at the time with the whole new metal thing was arguably influenced by Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah. But
when they came out with the Audio Slave record, for me, it was better than anything that was coming out at the time. It came from a completely different place. You didn't have, and because, obviously Zach De La Rocha was in front of it, and it was an amalgamation of everyone. To have Chris Cornell voice over like Tom Morello's guitar parts was, for me, just like bang, just blew my mind completely. And it seems to be one of those ones that when I talk to people who are in bands of sort of my age, that people in their sort of late 20s, early 30s seem to be the ones that people go back to. And like, I was chatting to the Howling Tides guys about stuff as well, and that was one album we all sort of agreed on, that this is a great guitar. It's a great guitar album. It is a fantastic guitar record, and it's absolutely slamming. All the songs, there's not a song you ever skip on it. And Tom Morello. And in fact, we were saying earlier about no one going after Dimebag Darrell. That's not true. I don't think. I think Tom Morello could go after Dimebag in terms of influential guitarists.
Yes, I would agree. He was so different.
He changed it, people used effects after him and everything else. I don't know if you've heard it. I saw a review once, and they were trying to say, I think it was around the time Audio Slave released Revelations, actually, and they were trying to slam Tom Morello and basically say that he was nothing without his guitar effects, basically, that he wasn't a great guitarist at all, and that it was all effects, which is absolute rubbish. And then, as most reviewers are, controversial.
Just throwing that in there.
You're always going to get some. I think there's it was like when there was go on a sidetrack. There was that reviewer who just went in attacked David Coverdale when he did that Purple album. And
Yes.
that wasn't like a review of the album. It was like a personal attack for no reason. And this felt like the same sort of thing. You know, it just felt like he decided he didn't like Tom Morello for whatever reason and was going to go attack him. But Tom Morello then went and released an album called The Night Watchman, which was a solo record that he did. And it was pure acoustic, like nothing on it. And it's incredible. If you've never heard it, check it out.
That's interesting.
But yeah, going back to the Audioslave record, I don't think there's, a finer team of musicians altogether. And I thought it was a shame that they never continued beyond the third album. I would have loved to have seen them continue with it. But there we go. Yeah, that's my number 3.
Yes, my number 3. It continues my trend of albums that have become so iconic and ingrained in culture that maybe you don't even want to go back and listen to it anymore because you hear it that often. It's Lynyrd Skynyrd with pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd. Again, it's got Freebird on it. It's got all of these iconic songs. Tuesday's Gone, and it's such a big album that it's. Every time you mention the subgenre of Southern rock, this is the album that everybody instantly assumes, this such and such a band will sound like if you say Southern rock. Every time a Southern rock band releases a record, it's, well, does it sound like this, essentially? And it's an album that has always... it's just ingrained, isn't it? And it's iconic. It changes the game, I think, particularly around that period of time, 1973. And it's, I believe that, they were knocking about for a while before. So again, it goes back to this thing of it's essentially a best of.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think, they were playing stuff like, the Freebird was in things years later. I remember it being in the Grand Theft Auto game as a big feature in the game.
I remember that.
Yeah, there was a big thing in that game, and they were playing that song at that point. A song from 1973. It's just entrenched, isn't it? Yeah, it's iconic. What more can you say, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's one of those albums that, like you say, is just etched on the DNA of everyone, really, and arguably every Southern band since, or any band that's got a Southern tinge to them, like you say. The first time I hear, Blackberry Smoke or George Thunderbolts or whoever it might be, the first thing you get comparisons to in reviews when they're trying to describe the band is Lynyrd Skynyrd. It's almost become an adjective in a band sound. That's how sort of iconic it's become.
And for me, I don't think that they ever remotely got close to this debut. I feel that this was undoubtedly their pinnacle. I think about it now. Simple Man. There's just so many that. How many times have these songs been covered? They're everywhere, aren't they? Throughout the decades.
Oh God, yeah, man.
People always come back to this one in particular. So that's why it has to be in my top 3. Moving on to the top 2, we're very, very tough now. I think any of these top 4 could be number 1 on another day, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely.
But yes, what is your number 3?
My number 2 goes back to...
Oh, number 2.
I can talk about Audioslave again if you like.
Yeah. I always get it wrong. I was so close to the end.
So good, man. You're obviously just trying to delay it. That's all. It's fine. But my number 2 choice does have a connection with my number 3 choice in the fact that it is again seeing band members of previous outfits join forces. and came around roughly around the same time. The sort of early 2000s, it seemed to be a bit of a birthing pool for super groups, for want of a better term. And my number 2 is Velvet Revolver and Contraband.
Yes.
This album was another album that had a completely massive impact on me. So much so, it's still an album I play regularly. It's been like 18 years since it came out. I think the reason it had such an impact on me is because it was obviously, you had Slash and Duff and Matt Sorum from Guns N' Roses. You had Scott Weiland of Stone Temple Pilots, of course, Mr. Dave Kushner as well. But because you had people from that sort of caliber of band, you would almost forgive them if it came out with a bit of a relaxed album, in a bit of a, we can put out, we don't have to work on this too hard. We've already got an audience there. All STP and Guns N' Roses fans are going to lap this up. Yeah. But they didn't come out like that. They came out from the moment Sucker Drain Bloom kicks onto the album. It's another band full of piss and vinegar, and it was another new band, and they were absolutely hungry as hell. And it had that real punk and roll attitude about it. And they were really, really hungry for it. And that came across, and I still think that comes across now. For me personally, it's definitely just my opinion, and it is definitely because of the age I was when it came out, but it had more of an impact on me than Appetite did. For the pure reason of I was around when it came out to make that impact. Yeah, around in I was born in 1987, so I think the album came out about a month before I was born. So as much as my dad was probably playing it, I probably didn't hear too much in the womb, and certainly not on a conscious level to appreciate the impact it had culturally. But when Contraband came out, I was 15, 16. I'd have been 15, 16 in 1987. It might be another story. But for me, that coming out the gates, it was. I loved Stone Temple Pilots and I loved Guns N' Roses from my dad playing them growing up. This was something new. This was something different. And again, like Audioslave, I found it to be bigger than the sum of its parts. And I felt like they didn't come out to phone it in. It came out with a real guttural punch. Obviously, you got tracks like Slither on it, and Fall to Pieces, I still think, is one of the best songs ever written. You got Sucker Train Blues, and all the songs going all the way through the album. Everything that's on that record is fantastic, and I just feel that the writing on it was really top quality. To think that it was nearly written with Josh Todd of Buckcherry singing was a bit weird.
Wow, that's close. Yeah.
To the point where Keith Nelson, formerly of Buckcherry, he's not in Buckcherry anymore, actually gets a writing credit on Saving the Alien off the album. Because when they were forming it as such, it was Slash, Duff, Matt, and then Josh Todd and Keith Nelson, Buckcherry. And at the point where they were writing songs together and everything. And then for whatever reason, it didn't work out, and they went back and sort of reformed Buckcherry with a new lineup, which is great because they came out with a 15 record, which I love. And then they brought in, at this point, Dave Kushner and Scott Weiland, and seeing them on that tour, like so earlier mentioning Silvertide, so I'm on that tour, and that was at Brixton Academy in London, and the power that they delivered those songs with. They made Brixton Academy feel like a sweaty punk club gig. I mean, there was literally like you're like when you're really small in a gig and the energy is really great, but you come out in other people's sweat. Yes. It was like that walking out of Brixton. I've never experienced that before. On like it's not, it's not Wembley, but it's a pretty big Brixton Academy. Still an academy-sized venue, and to come out of there when everyone's completely soaked in each other's sweat because it's just been that sort of energy throughout the whole night was really insane. And like I say, for me, it was an influence on my bass playing. It was an influence on the songs and stuff I started writing, and arguably then fed into bands that I loved, so like Buckcherry and everything coming back through the ranks. And it seems to be, again, another album that has influenced other bands that I like who are now coming through the ranks. I know me and Arjun of Guerrilla Riot have spoke heavily about Contraband and what an influence that is and what a great record it is. So yeah, that's got to be my number 2.
That's a solid shout. My number 2, I'm going in with a heavy hitter again. It's Black Sabbath with Black Sabbath, obviously.
I'm with that, mate.
it's what can you say about this record that people haven't said? You know, it's so iconic. From the opening track, obviously entitled Black Sabbath. There's these great stories of Tony Iommi saying about when they'd play these songs, probably particularly that one, that it was so different that people were terrified by it. They'd run out and scream. Like it was. I think he summed it up perfectly, where he said that he was watching horror movies and he was like, well, why can't we do that for music? Yeah. And it's like, it's almost like that. It's like, they'd put horror and rock together, and obviously by pure happy coincidence, Tony Iommi had to loosen the strings on his guitar, giving them, a heavier sound. Almost creating what would become heavy metal overnight, really. It's so iconic. I mean, there's everything there, isn't there? You hear time and time again nowadays. There's so many bands that will cite this album as, a moment where it's changed everything. Yeah, I mean, Ozzy, it's so, I mean, have you heard, particularly around that time as well? I mean, this early 1970, this came out. I mean, was there a singer like Ozzy Osbourne? No, not remotely.
Ozzy only got the job because he had a PA, I mean.
He came, there's that amazing story where apparently he came to do the audition and he was walking down the stairs down to the place, and he had a shoe that he was just holding like some kind of pet, dragging this random shoe along. And it's like anybody else would take one look at this guy and think he's a raving lunatic. Let's not go anywhere near this man. But I think that they must have looked at him and took a gamble. There must have been something, where they thought, we're going to give this guy a go and just let him do whatever he's going to do, because even today it's so different. His vocal ability. I mean, I remember my dad saying that when he first went to see them. He grew up with the Robert Plants and the Ian Gillans and like these powerful vocalists, and he said that he couldn't get on with them at first because they were that different. Yeah, he heard Ozzy sing and he was like, I like the band, but I don't like the singer. And apparently there was loads of people that were saying this at the time. They were like, I'm not so sure about this singer, because he was just that different.
I can understand that, because like you say, at the time you had, Gillan, Planty, all these sort of higher register powerhouses, where Ozzy was singing. He did go sort of higher pitched in his solo career, but what people forget is in Sabbath in the early 80s, he was much more in that lower register. That almost, droning's not the right term, but it was, it wasn't a powerful vocal.
And there's this thing where, like particularly with like songs like Iron Man, he sings along to the guitar. Da, 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 da. It's at that point in time that's so unusual. Yeah. Like you wouldn't hear Robert Plant singing along to the guitar. It wouldn't work. No. And I think that it's as I say, it's a complete game changer. You had all of these bands post that album. I can listen to bands today that will have Sabbathy things in there, particularly from that first record. But a band that was very nearly, some will say, completely responsible for metal. So,
yeah. I mean, you say that, especially on that first album. I mean, that came out, was it very early 1970, wasn't it?
Yeah, apparently, according to Wikipedia, February 1970.
So you've got an album that's 52 years old, and arguably, like we were saying, on some other albums that have come into the list, I would argue you could put that on now and it would stand along with most metal bands these days.
Yeah.
Tracks like NIB, previously to that, I mean, Geezer Butler's always been a huge influence on me as a bass player. His bass playing that he was doing in 1970. And yes, you had people like John Entwistle as well. He was also bringing it to the foreground, but no one was playing like Geezer. And I would argue that no one has played like Geezer since. Not really. And same with Tony Iommi's playing. Obviously, some of that was due to the injury as well, but the amount of riffs that man has come up with over time is insane. Like, we go about Ozzy's solo work there. There's obviously a collaboration on that between him and Tony Iommi on the new album Patient Number 9. And Ozzy said, like, when Tony Iommi came back with a riff of him, he's like, why didn't you have that for 13? Like, that's why didn't you have that for Last Sabbath album? And same with Bill Ward. You know, he was essentially you kind of basically had a heavy jazz drummer, a guitarist who like mucked his fingers up in a horrific industrial accident.
On paper, it's a disaster.
Yeah, Ozzy,
you know.
and Geezer, who really wanted to play lead guitar.
Yeah.
You know, on paper, like you say, it should have lasted about a fortnight, but instead it lasted, 50 years off and on, like as a live.
Yeah.
Nearly 50 years and still going strong. And arguably their influence has reached across the world and across all kinds of genres of music, particularly obviously in the formation of heavy metal and rock music. And, it all started with this album where you've got the likes of NIB on it. You've obviously got Black Sabbath itself. The whole album's just absolutely storming from start to finish. It's just one of those records, mate. So
it is.
I punch myself in the face for not picking it.
It felt like it has to be there for me. I remember listening to this one as a teenager, and I still thought, I was like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
And this is at a time where, you've got bands that are, doing way more heavier stuff at this point. You had like Slipknot and really like very heavy stuff. But you can see where the origin of that genre is with this album. And such a benchmark moment.
It's even so that they used it as the influence for 13, didn't they? I remember seeing an interview.
Yeah. It feels those two in particular, 13 feels like the brother of this. It's like there was what is it called, like Zeitgeist? Is something like that. That is clearly like Planet Caravan. There's a clear thing there. So it even went on to essentially influence themselves at the end of the career. It's just crazy. But yes, the big moment, number one. Now, before we do this, I had a little prediction, didn't I? As we went into the videos. Lee was saying that this one is your Desert Island Disc.
Yeah, I would describe this album as my Desert Island Disc album. It's the album I've always said if I was stranded on a desert island and I was only allowed to listen to one album for the rest of the time, it would be this.
And at first I thought, because you were like, oh, it's a one and done album. This person was not here anymore. At first I was like, it has to be. Surely, is it Jeff Buckley?
Yeah, it is.
I had a hunch. And for me, it was like when you said that this guy did one album and that was it. And I thought, you would have grown up in the 90s. You're a 90s kid. And it's like, this is the only guy I can think of. But honestly, last night, I was like, who else could this be? I can't argue with it.
It's just like you say, we were saying earlier about it, you had earlier in your choices. And for me, I grew up, my dad was listening to music. Music has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. And in the midst of listening to bands like we were talking about earlier, like Rage Against the Machine and the whole Brittle thing with Wild Hearts and bands like Ugly Kid Joe as well and stuff like I was listening to off my own back, I remember hearing Mojo Pin was the first song I heard.
Oh, yeah.
and it was completely different. It was stripped right back, you know, it wasn't heavy on guitars. It was just Jeff Buckley and his Telecaster. And I was like, who is this man and what is his voice? You know, even as I mean, when it came out in 94, so what would have been like 7 or 8 years old. And I was like, what's this? You know, what is this? And I'm badgering my parents, you know, I need to hear more of this guy. And my parents always been, you know, my mum's like a completely different taste in music to my dad, but there was always music about the house. So, and it wasn't like I was trying to listen to anything too destructive at that point in time. So, you know, they bought me the Grace album on cassette, and I can't tell you how many times I listened to that. So much so that I wore out the cassette by the time I got a bit older, and I went out and bought it on CD. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when I got my vinyl starting, there was like there's obviously, you know, vinyl can be quite expensive these days. So I had a ruling with vinyl collection. Me and Jay sort of made a pact ourselves that the albums we got on vinyl were the albums that were special to us. Yeah. And it wasn't, you know, you weren't just going to throw away money on an album on a whim where you like 2 songs. It's got, because especially with vinyl, where you put on a vinyl, that's a commitment. You are, you know, sitting down and listening to that properly. Yeah. And I think that's sometimes the way you delve into things of an album as well, to sit down and give it that time. But, you know, this album was at the top of my list, and I always loved it. And it was an album I went back to because, you know, you grow up and stuff. And I remember really having a huge impact when it came out on me as a kid, and seeing them headphones in and soaking up tracks like Goodbye, like Last Goodbye. And you mentioned earlier, like Lilac Wine and So Real, Grace itself, of course. And without doubt, the most beautiful rendition you will ever hear of Hallelujah. And I'll put my last 2 quid on that. You know, I think, you know, that's the best rendition of Hallelujah, hands down. And like we mentioned, you know, Leonard Cohen even said himself that, you know, Jeff Buckley did the best version of it, which I love. And, you know, fair play to Leonard Cohen for just going, you know what?
Yeah,
I prefer that. And that's great. I think there's a lot of songwriters out there that sometimes, not often, but sometimes a cover is better than original. Not very often. It's very rare, because obviously normally the person that writes a song will have the most emotional connection to it, and that will get translated. But the sort of, one of Jeff Buckley's biggest assets, I think, was how emotional he was in his tone and his delivery. You know, all the way through that album is quite a dark record in its tone. It's not dark, obviously, in the sense of Sabbath or something like that, but in the tone of the lyrics and the quality of things. And I just think the fact that he never got, obviously, he was writing the second album when he passed away, but the fact he never got to follow up that album properly. I know they did a posthumous release of the bits and pieces he'd recorded, which to me, don't ever do that. If it's not,
it didn't feel right. I listened to it. It was like sketches by something or other.
My Drunken Heart or something like that.
Yeah.
I just feel that if an artist has created a piece of work and they've completed it fully and it's already in line, like when Chuck Berry died, he'd already written his latest album, he recorded it. It was all set to, it'd been mixed, he'd heard it, he'd okayed it. It was all set to be released, but he sadly passed away. And they still released it. To me, that's okay, because the artist has signed off. They wanted that artwork to be represented. But when you get the sort of, well, we've got 4 lyrics that he sang once and a take of a guitar part here and some drum bit, and we can fill in on this bit, it'll be fine. It's never going to be what the artist wanted it to be. So I think that was a bad move. But to be fair, most of the time, the only album everybody will ever talk about when they talk about Jeff Buckley is Grace.
Yeah.
And all the way through that record, it's what I would call a bottle of wine record. I want that on my vinyl player, bottle of wine, chill out, soak it up. And it doesn't matter how many times I listen to it. There's some albums that I have to walk away from a little bit, not in a horrible way. Just, you know, there's certain albums you listen to and you go, I've had enough of that for a bit, put it on the shelf. You know, listen to some other stuff, and you come back a couple of months, couple of weeks, whatever it might be. For me, I don't think I'll ever get bored of listening to Grace. And the impact it had culturally on it. It's funny, we were doing this. I don't know, we were talking about Darkness earlier, and I don't know if you watched the Justin Hawkins.
Yeah, he's literally just
done one about Jeff.
Yeah.
And he was talking about that on there. And it was literally just because I'll have it on while I'm doing stuff. And I had it on, And I was like, oh, okay, now I'm going to look like I'm ripping off Justin Hawkins talking.
When that video came out, I think it was like the other day or something. It just reaffirmed. I was like, it's a sign.
But he talks about on there that Radiohead were doing an album, and I can't remember what song it was now, but basically they were struggling to do the vocal takes, or Tom York was struggling to do the vocal takes on one song. And for the life of me, I can't remember what the track was now.
It was something like something trees.
Yeah.
Tall trees or something. I'm not much of a Radiohead guy, but
you know, they went out. They decided, right, we're going to take a break from the studio, get away from this, go clear our heads or whatever, and went to the garage in London where Jeff Buckley was playing, and Tom York just heard him and then completely changed his whole approach to how he was going to do the song. He said it gave him the confidence to sing in that higher falsetto kind of register, and they did it in 3 takes and then burst into tears, you know, and it just shows how emotive the music can be. And to have that kind of impact on a band like Radiohead. I mean, Radiohead in the 90s, Jesus, you know, they were a real strong band, you know, they still, you know, and arguably in the 90s, they were definitely sort of at their sort of creative peak and the thing, so they had no reason to doubt who they were and what they were doing, changing their approach or whatever. But to go watch someone like that and go, no, you know what, I think that's what I need. And he had all these influences from artists who were already established, and to artists that come through the ranks, to 18-year-old kids, like you were saying earlier in the vinyl store.
Yeah, literally a couple of months ago.
So yeah,
still like, well, I have to get that.
Yeah, so you're talking like decades after he passed away, and he's still got that grab on people. That's got to be my number one. Simple.
It's a fair shout. I feel that the closest thing that has come out post his passing, that is kind of the spiritual successor, is it's a kind of compilation album. But it's just called You and I.
Okay, yeah.
And I think it's the closest thing tonally that you can get to if Jeff Buckley was to release another album. It feels like it's in this tone, and there's it's material that he had recorded, along with possibly the most eeriest story that he ever tells about. He's just talking, and it's while tinkering on a guitar about a dream he had, which inspired him to write the song "You and I."
Okay.
And it's eerie. He talks about this dream, and he's kind of telling this story, and it's unraveling the story as it goes along, and it's beautiful. On there, he does a couple of covers, very much like he did on Grace.
Yeah.
He does a couple of Smith songs, which really work. And it feels the closest thing. So if anybody listens to Grace and thinks, well, I need something else that's Jeff Buckley, I would say go to that one. Not anything else. There have been the rest of these compilations, but I think this one is the one that's the most respectful. I don't know whether they'd just found unreleased material, like a more recent discovery, but there's no stuff where other people have filled in for him.
That's good.
It's material that he has done. So yeah, that's just a bit of a side note.
Oh, I'll check that out.
Yeah, it's worth a listen. If you listen to Grace and you want a bit more, I'd go for that one. My number one. There's one person left who, in my book, has completely changed everything forever. It's Jimi Hendrix with "Are You Experienced?" Cool. Again, it's littered with classics that you will no doubt hear far worse versions in pubs. You know, for me, it's outrageous that he would come out with a debut album that would have "Hey Joe," Purple Haze, like these
Red House.
Pardon?
Foxy Ladies on.
Yeah, Foxy Lady. It's again. It's you look at this record and the opening 6 or 7 tracks are outrageous. They're all classics. So much so that if you have a cover band play any event, or a guitar-based cover band, people will request these songs to be played today. When did this come out? It came out in 1967. Ironically, the same year that the Doors released their record as well. So it was obviously at a time where things were, changing. Yeah. And there's this crazy story about Hendrix where, he wasn't getting enough out of the amps and things. So he was essentially like, to get that fuzzy sound that he'd have, because there wasn't pedals and things for that. He was just cranking them up to the point where he was distorting these amps and breaking them to get the sound he wanted. He was just literally just cranking it. And so during these gigs that he would play, his amp was quite literally disintegrating as it was going on. Like, it would have just absolutely vibrated it to death. So Lord knows how many he got through. But yeah, it changed everything, didn't it?
Oh, good.
It's the, as you mentioned back when I talked about Van Halen, it's, he was the guy before.
Yeah.
He's another one where, he had the unfortunate premature passing.
Yeah.
Of course, he went on to do a few more records after, but, he was another guy that I think would have gone on to have done other things. I mean, there was a rumor, apparently, it was in some documentary, apparently he wanted to go off and start an experiment with different genres.
Yeah, I saw some of those. So those talks of a jazz project, and
and maybe he'd have gone on to do kind of the David Bowie thing, where every so often he changes a genre or something, perhaps. I mean, it's hypothetical at this point, but I mean, it makes you wonder, because it's like, if he changed rock to what it is kind of today, then what would he have done for other things? Yeah. Would it have been successful? Would it have not? Who knows? But I think that, every record that he released was pretty iconic.
Oh, good.
I think this is the one, again, even though it's the debut, it's the one people look to, isn't it? When you say Jimi Hendrix,
it's like you say, it's almost like a greatest hits without being the greatest hits.
Yeah.
And we've got everything else on. I mean, I remember going to see Blackstone Cherry at Wembley, and halfway through they did a cover of Purple Haze, and like a little section of Purple Haze in the middle of a thing. They jammed it out and went into Purple Haze, and then came back to whatever they were playing before. I can't remember if it was Rain Wizard or whatever. But they sort of jammed it out and went into Purple Haze, and arguably the biggest audio callback, if you like, was the "Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky" lyric, when they Chris Robinson fed it to the crowd, but it was like the whole Wembley just taking over that "Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky" lyric. And this stuff, when you see like that, all the way through to, like you say, any pub on a Friday and a Saturday night, any open night, anything where anyone's got a chance to play. Like going back to what we talked about, my mate Max, who was doing this sort of Eruption thing. I remember one of the first riffs he showed me that he was like, that he got down was Purple Haze, and it was just like, wow, someone who knows this. And I think inevitably it's still a sign of cool. It's still a really cool. You see someone walking through town with a Hendrix t-shirt on, and you go, oh, he knows.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's that thing, and it's still a talking point. Like, I've walked through town with Hendrix t-shirts and gone and rock pubs and just got chat to people, and I think it's still that thing. It's still a talking point, because he, like you say, sadly passed away, and sadly passed to the 27 Club, like Jim Morrison. is that thing where people are going to wonder what they were going to do because they had such an influence, such a short period of time. And this coming from, an American former paratrooper who was left-handed and got told he shouldn't be playing guitar.
Yeah. Again, I think that the interesting thing with a lot of these iconic musicians, on paper, should it have worked? Probably no. And it was, he was, as I say, he was distorting his amplifiers. He was breaking things.
Crazy.
He was setting fire to his guitars, smashing them, doing things that people would consider just to be completely insane back in that era.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have any guitarist now that sets fire to their guitar, people will go, well, Jimi Hendrix did that. So what? It's just everything. I mean, he's an icon. Just his image alone is just kind of in pop culture now. Timeless.
I mean, how many people do you walk? You're at a festival somewhere. How many tattoos of Hendrix do you see when you walk about?
Yeah. Exactly. It's, all done by a guy that did it all before 27, which is madness to think about, really, isn't it? I mean, I'm 28, so I'm already a year over. And I haven't achieved that yet. So.
Don't worry, mate. I'm 34 and I've not achieved it either.
But yes, that was our top 10 debut albums. I'm interested to know, I'm sure you are as well, Lee. What is your top 10? Comment below, because clearly, I mean, we have very different top 10s, clearly. And I'm sure there's some that we've both missed. Yeah, there's going to be one, I think, that I'll go, I wish I'd have included that. But the big thing I was looking at through this, I was looking at kind of iconic bands, as you could probably tell, but there was so many where you would assume that they would have a game-changing debut album, and it wasn't. Like, I would say AC/DC. Like, for me, it wasn't the game changer. That came later.
I'd say the same about Aerosmith.
Exactly. Like, so I'd be interested to hear the audience choices. So comment below and let us know. Thank you very much.